On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His most recent is The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Democracyatwork.info is the website, as well as rdwolff with 2fs.com, and you can tweet him at Prof Wolff with 2fs at the end. Professor Wolff, we have been talking about inflation, and I have two questions to put to you. The first is, you know, the monthly figures come out for inflation, and the most recent one was less than 1% for the month, but everybody multiplied that by 12 and said, oh my God, it's over 8%. When you have monthly variations throughout the course of the year, and it may well end up that the year is over 8%, or it may end up that it's way below that. Number one, why do we always take these monthly numbers and magnify them? And number two, to what extent is the current inflation that we're experiencing, given the evidence that we're finding of how corporate America is behaving right now, being driven by corporate greed as opposed to, you know, oil shocks or pent-up demand or other things?
Okay, on the first question, there really isn't much sense. Graduate students in economics are routinely told, don't get attached to any particular monthly statistic because it'll change and you can't generalize from 1 month. And that's true. On the other hand, by watching month by month, and by the way, there are people who watch it week by week, but watching month by month does give you a sense of the direction. And people who have to make plans for things that won't happen for 2 months or 6 months or 12 or 18, they are often very needy of some sense of where it's going in order to make decisions now that won't really pan out for several months. And so it's always guesswork. And they like to have a sense of where it's going. So with our inflation numbers, since the number has gone up every month, excuse me, it's a pretty good bet that we aren't yet out of the woods, not only in terms of an inflation, but an inflation that's getting worse.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Number two, and right along following from this, every corporation in the United States, with a few exceptions, had a couple of rough years. I mean, we know the exceptions, you know, Amazon, because it delivered packages during the crisis and so on. But most companies either suffered unemployment or suffered COVID-related problems. And so their profits for the year 2020 and the year 2021 took a hit. Some more, some less, but they took a hit. Then, when it looks like in the second half of 2021 and into the present, it looks like we're coming back at least part way from how bad it was back then in terms of COVID and in terms of the unemployment and so forth that we suffered. Here's what corporations want to do. You can call them greedy if you want, but it's the logic of our system. They want to make up for what they lost. They're not interested in just getting by, you know, resuming what they did before. They want to make up for what they didn't get, and they want to do it quickly. And the quickest way to make more profits, and this is basic economics, is to jack up the price. And that's what they're doing. Of course, when they do that, they don't want the bad publicity. They don't want to be thought of as doing what they're doing, namely jacking up the price to make more profits. You know, there's an irony here, Tom. In business school, we teach young businessmen and women that every decision you make as a corporate bigwig is based on what will enhance your profitability. If profits go up, so does your career. If profits go down, unfortunately, so does your career. So we tell them every decision has a goal, has a bottom line, profit. And then when they make the decision to raise prices, they go, oh my goodness, I don't want that to be understood as profit profiteering, which is what it is, I want it to be blamed on somebody else. Then we begin the stories, the long supply chain disruptions, whatever exactly that is. Or here's a one I really like. I have to raise my prices because all the other employers, like me, are doing it. And I don't want to get behind the eight ball. I have to pay them more, so I'm going to charge more. Or here's another one, which is really false these days. I have to recoup what I pay in extra wages to my workers. Just a footnote, wages are rising much more slowly than prices. So the argument that the price rise is a response to the wage is really silly and counts on people not knowing what the numbers are. Bottom line, only if we were on the inside of a private capitalist enterprise, really knowing what their books tell us, only then would we have the evidence to determine whether a price increase is designed to jack up profits or has some other justification or motivation. Since these companies who are telling us why they're raising prices never let us look at their books, they're asking us to believe them when they have an immense incentive to not tell us that profit is in fact what's driving the inflation.
How, if we were to put into place a windfall profits tax, for example, which, has been discussed in Democratic circles a lot recently, how do you do that? I mean, I'm thinking back to the 70s, but back in the 70s, when a corporation reported that they had a $300 million profit this year, they also reported that to the IRS and they paid taxes on that $300 million profit. Right. Somehow corporations have come up with a two-book accounting system these days where they say to their stockholders, hey, we had a $30 billion profit this year and we're going to distribute part of that as dividends to you. And then they say to the IRS, oh, hey, we lost money. I'm sorry, we don't owe any taxes. So how do you even put into place a windfall profits tax if, as you said, Professor Wolff, these corporations are not sharing their actual books with us?
Well, the way it's been done in the past, I mean, everything you say is correct, and the only genuine, rational way would be to open the books. And so we can all see what's going on, and we can all make an agreement on what we're going to do, and there aren't these shenanigans. But as long as we allow corporations to keep the books to themselves, we are at their mercy. So what was done with excess profits tax was a simple formula, which, because it was simple, wasn't altogether fair from one company to another. But here's what was done. You take an average. Typically, you take an average profit over the previous, say, 3 years before the excess profits tax is to go into effect, and you say, okay, over those 3 years, this was the average. And if you want to be very nice, you say, if it was rising across these 3 years, we'll take the average and we'll increase it by the average rate of increase over those 3 years. And that will be considered the profit you were entitled to get this year when the excess profits tax goes into effect. But if you made more than that, if you reported that to the IRS, or if you reported it to your shareholders because you want them to think well of you as a board of directors, well, then the excess profit tax hits right there. And I should remind people, the excess profits tax had its origin early in American history. It has come up repeatedly. And usually the rationale was that something was going on that was disproportionately profiting a very small number of people and costing a very large number of people a great deal, and that elemental justice would call for saying we shouldn't allow a war, which is the time that it was most often brought into the conversation. If we're making American men and women die fighting for the country wherever, then it is somehow ugly and grotesque to allow other people who are not fighting and risking their lives to make a fortune off of the same war. And so war profiteering became this. You had this during the Second World War. War profiteering became something everybody said we should not allow,
Right.
and it seemed reasonable taxing the excess profits of the defense sellers in order to help the families of people whose people had been killed or wounded fighting for the country.
Right. In
and
fact,
you could make a parallel argument about COVID. We've lost 1 million people, lives destroyed, families destroyed. Is it reasonable for billionaires to become even richer with money that could be taxed and used to compensate people who weren't blessed by the COVID disaster, but were destroyed by it, being compensated by part of the gains of those who made money off of the hard times?
This is what FDR had to say about that.
Our present emergency and a common sense of decency make it imperative that no new group of war millionaires shall come into being in this nation as a result of the struggles abroad. The American people will not relish the idea of any American citizen growing rich and fat in an emergency of blood and slaughter and human suffering.
Professor Wolff, we have 30 seconds. Do you think that sort of message could fly today?
I think it could. I think if we had a courageous leadership that was willing to say, and I couldn't say it one iota better than President Roosevelt just did. Yeah, I think the American people would surprise many by how strongly they would react to all of that.
Yeah.
Polls suggest it, and decency is exactly the right word. It would be, I think, widely supported.
Yeah, and in fact, he put Harry Truman in charge of rooting out the war profiteers, and they went to town. Professor Richard Wolff, thanks so much for dropping by. It's great talking with you again.